That means I think we need to say something about the parents of these kids, don't we? The parents are working with them at home. That means we need to say something about our teachers here because they're working because their children are getting the information in class. And isn't that good? And even Bryson tonight made me think of something. You know, Bryson answers our questions. But did you know that Bryson is also an example for us in another way? Bryson's looking at me right now. What's he about to say? Did you know that Bryson's been inviting his kindergarten teacher to church? Did you invite somebody this week? Bryson has recently. So can't we learn from them as they're so enthused? Aren't they happy to be down there? Aren't they just full of energy down here? I know sometimes it's chaotic, but that's okay. Aren't they something we can learn from? I think they are. I want you to go with me to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, and that's where we'll begin tonight because I want to do something that will be seen, at least to a degree, a bit unusual. I want to tell you the end before we get to the beginning. Because I believe the end is going to help us shape what we need to see because it's going to answer a question to us. It's going to answer the question of how did he have that attitude? You know, our attitudes in life are extremely important. And we are all in charge of our own happiness. Every one of us is. But we don't always have the same lives, do we? Sometimes we're dealt what we would call a poor hand. Sometimes we have bad days. You ever had a bad year? Sometimes we have bad years. Sometimes we have bad seasons. And sometimes we have great things happen to us and great years and great seasons. But it's in Genesis chapter 50, if you'll look with me at two different passages, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20 and verse 24, that we read about a man who had a great life, even though many would say it was a poor life. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "But as for you, you thought it evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." Boy, that's an attitude, isn't it? To know that your own brethren, your brothers, they sold you into slavery. And you ended up in Egypt a slave, but you were separated from your family, and you hadn't seen your father in a number of years. And matter of fact, your father, by the time this is written in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he's dead. But yet he looks at his own brethren and says, "You meant it to me for evil." But listen to what he says, "But God meant it for good." That's a good attitude, isn't it? You look at verse 24 in Genesis chapter 50. It's time for him to pass away, and Joseph said unto his brethren, "I die." Very often in the Old Testament, you'll see phrases, and they're very short, of so-and-so who passed away and so-and-so who died. But it's here in Genesis 50:24 where Joseph said unto his brethren, "It's my time. I'm going to die." And listen to what he says. "And God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Look at his outlook on life. He says, "It's my time to die, but God will be faithful to you." He goes back to Abraham, he goes back to Isaac, and he goes back to Jacob, and he says, God was faithful to them, he'll be faithful to you. And if anyone, in the context of what we're reading about tonight in Genesis chapter 50, could say that God was faithful to them, wasn't the man speaking in verse 24? Who had just said some 4 verses ago in Genesis 50:20 that you, my own family, meant it to evil, but God, he meant it for good. In other words, God didn't leave me while you sold me. God didn't leave me when I was sold into Egypt. God didn't leave me in prison. God didn't leave me when I was in trouble. He brings them back to God. And he reminds them at his death, the only person that will be faithful to you is the Lord. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of our lesson, but it's also the end of our lesson tonight. Because we're going to study about a man of whom was dealt a very poor hand. And it brings us all the way back to Genesis chapter 37. If you'll turn back there, we will spend our entire lesson tonight in Genesis 37 looking at the approximate first 11 verses of this chapter. Because inside of Genesis chapter 37, verse 8, his brothers and his family say to him in the connecting verses toward the end of verse 11, "Shall you indeed reign over us?" We have someone who had a dream. And in that dream, it was depicted that he would reign over his family. He would be exalted above his family. And his brothers didn't like it, so they said, will you really indeed reign over us? It's akin to saying, that's not going to happen. But yet it did. And Genesis 50:20 and Genesis 50:24 shows us the attitude of which is needed in life. 5 quick things I want us to look at. Number 1, I want to look at the problem. Number 2, I want to look at the hatred. Number 3, I want to look at the dreams. Number 4, I want to look at the words. And then number 5, I want to look at the actions of which some individuals took, all in Genesis chapter 37, verses 1 through 11. Let's start out by this phrase. And this is something I think is true. You and I need to be honest. Because inside of our lesson tonight, we're going to find individuals who actually lived, of which we will be like-minded with. And we're going to see some people of which we're going to say, I would never do that. And we're going to see some people of which we say, boy, I wish I was more like that. But here's what I mean by let's be honest. When we get to the point where we say, boy, I would never do that, I want us to reconsider that phrase. Not in the fact that we won't do it again, but I want us to consider, have we ever done that? And I think if we're honest in our lives, we'll all see that we can have room improvement inside of our lives. So let's look at the first thing that begins us with the problem. And the problem takes us to Genesis chapter 37. It picks us up inside of verse 3. And it reads this way: Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and made him a coat of many colors. I believe there's no question in your mind and in mine, I know in mine it's not a question, of how easy it is to love your children. Before we had Charlie, Kelly and I lost a child, and that made Charlie extra special. And for many of you, that also happened in your lives. And there's a danger for us as we live as parents to be involved in something like Genesis 37, verse 3. Here's the problem. It was not that Israel loved his children. It was that he loved one more than the rest. I want you to see that at the front of this account. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, so much so that he made him stand out differently visually. He made him a coat of many colors, and I would suggest to you this coat was unseen to the people of his day. You could call Joseph a trendsetter in our day. He had something that everybody else wanted, and you'll see that as we go through, because you'll see the brothers who envied Joseph. And we'll see that in just a minute. But if we're being honest in our lives, we need to take a look back into our lives, and we need to look at this word, and it's a very important word because it's the problem of Genesis 37:3, favoritism. It is very easy to pick a favorite in this life, isn't it? We all have favorites in certain areas, but sometimes that breeds problems, doesn't it? It did in Genesis 37:8. We have a father of whom loved his children. I believe there's no doubt that he loved all of his children. But we have a father that singled one out. And he made him special. And he made him more special than the rest. And he did things for him that he never did for any of his other children. And I want to tell you something about what happened in this particular occasion, Genesis 37:3. We already know the rest of the story, as some would say. We know what's going to happen. His brothers are going to hate him. They're going to sell him. And they're going to say some wild beast must have got a hold of him and present him as if he was dead. The truth is, favoritism breeds hatred. And what I want us to do is think about this for just a moment. Favoritism breeds hatred in our families, doesn't it? We can't say the answer to that is no, because in Genesis 37, verse 3, especially we get into verses 4, 5, and 6, we're going to see that the reason they hated him was because his father loved him so much. Favoritism breeds hatred in our families. It did then, and it still can now. Favoritism breeds hatred in congregations. Did you know that? In any group setting of people, if you take a group of people, this is real seen in high school. If you take any group of people, a favorite will eventually be promoted, and someone in that group will envy that person, and hatred will begin to form. Did you know the same thing that happened inside of this family could happen with you and me? Not only does favoritism breed hatred in our families and congregations, it can happen in our work lives, can it? You've probably seen this. The person of which could do no wrong to the boss. The person, and this is the phrase we usually say, he could get away with murder. Did that not breed envy inside of the workplace? And then inside of our regular lives, in all the other areas, favoritism can breed problems inside of our lives. You see, the problem was not that a man loved his son. The problem was a father loved his son more than the rest. And I'm here to tell you that it breeded hate inside of this family. So the problem is simple. Genesis 37:3. A father loved his son more than all the rest. Next, let's notice the hatred. This happens in Genesis 37, verse 4. And it reads this way, and when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Remember that problem we talked about from Genesis 37:3? If you didn't believe me, you can believe me now from verse 4. His brothers, his family, they saw, I love that word saw, with their own eyes. Now listen to this, that their father, well, his father and their father, that he loved him more than his brethren. Do you not see the problem with that? If you don't, by the time we get through with tonight, you'll see the problem with favoritism in certain areas of our lives. But there's two things I want you to see about the problem and the hatred that was formed because of the problem. Number one, I want you to see this phrase inside of Genesis 37:4. They hated him. And then I want you to see this phrase. They could not speak peaceably unto him. Here's the first one. It's they hated him. If you look at this phrase and you look at the word hated, it's just a word that means hate. But it's deeper than that. It's a word that means enemy or foe, as in adversary. Imagine this for just a moment. You have a father that loves one more than the rest, and the others hate him so much that they've become enemies. You go back to Genesis 37:4. Why did they hate him? Because his father loved him more than all his brethren, and they hated him for it. It's interesting to me to note that this word hate or hated here is used in a variety of ways, and I want you to see the last few ways. It's enemies. It's enemy. It's interesting to me that we understand that there can be problems in families, can't there? Ever been problems in your family? I would suggest to you that Genesis 37, this is a very big problem within a family. But here's the reality of this. The problem that we discussed just a moment ago was never addressed, and therefore hatred was born. And they hated him so much that they wanted him to fail. And in the context of what was written about them and about what they did in their lives, they could not speak peaceably unto him. This idea of peaceably is an interesting word. It's a word that means safe. It's a word that means happy and friendly, and the idea of prosperity and peace and health and welfare. That's good, isn't it? Everybody wants to be safe. Do you want to be safe? You know, we live in a world of which is really driven by our safety anymore, isn't it? That's why we lock church building doors, isn't it? That's why we have security sitting in church buildings, isn't it? That's why you lock your car at night. Did you always used to lock your car? I didn't. Until somebody got in it at work and stole something out of my truck. That ever happened to you? You like your car now, don't you? Did you used to live up or grow up? Live up. Did you ever grow up in a time? Live up, we'll go with that. You ever lived up when you didn't lock your front door? But you do now, don't you? Now, I'm not going to say who shook their head to tell you whose door is unlocked right now. But that's kind of the world we live in, isn't it? We want safety, and we're driven by safety. What about happiness? Do you want to be happy? I want to be happy. I know you want to be happy. Do you want to be friendly? Let me ask it this way. Do you want people to be friendly to you? Maybe we need to work on our friendliness. Do you want to live in prosperity? You know, we do live in prosperity. Sometimes we feel so poor for us, don't we? I ain't got enough money. You ever not had enough money? Well, you're going to not have enough money again, so better get used to that. But we've got more money than most people in the entire world. Matter of fact, we live above 99% of the entire world. I don't say that haughtily, but that's just a fact. And we think we're poor. Don't you want to have peace? Don't you want to have good health? Don't you want to have good welfare and live a long life? Well, that's this word peaceably. But look at how it's used. They could not speak safety. They could not speak happiness. They could not speak friendliness. They could not speak prosperity. They could not speak peace. They could not speak health. And they could not speak welfare to who? Their flesh and blood. It's interesting if you look at this word peaceably, there is no negative form of this word. It's only positive. You have to modify the word with the word not to make this word negative. Isn't that interesting to you? They hated their brother so much because their father loved him so, and they could not speak peaceably unto him. I'm telling you that hatred tonight breeds hate. It happens in our families. It's happening right here in Genesis 37:4. Because their father loved him so much, they hated him. It happens in congregations, doesn't it? When someone else gets the spotlight, when someone else gets praised. It does, doesn't it? It happens in work. Have you ever seen the one person who does nothing get the praise? That's happened before, hasn't it? In other areas of our lives, this exists. I'm telling you, hatred breeds hate. They hated what their father did so much that they hated their brother so that they could not speak to him and they could not speak peaceably to him. They hated him. The problem, the hatred. Let's see the dreams. What caused some of these things to take place and what caused some of it to get worse? Because as of right now, here's what we have. We have a father who loves a son. We have a son who's hated by his brothers. And that's as far as it's gone. But it's going to get worse, isn't it? And that's what happens with the dreams. And this is Genesis 37, verse 5. And Joseph dreamed a dream. And he told it to his brethren, and they hated him. Listen to this. Yet the more. As if they didn't already hate him, they hated him yet the more. I want you to see a few passages that builds this into your mind. Look at Genesis 37:7. He tells them the dream. He's going to tell them in verses 5 and 6. Verse 7, behold, we were binding sheaves in a field. And lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaf stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. What's the context of that? He's being exalted, isn't it? And his family is giving reverence to him, isn't it? Verse 9, he dreamed yet another dream and told it his brethren and said, behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. He's talking about his entire family now, even his father and mother. And they hated him more. Now, I think there's a principle that's at play here in Genesis 37, 7, and 9. You don't always have to tell what you know. But you always have to tell what comes from God. I understand that in some issues in life, sometimes we just need to shut the mouth, don't we? You ever feel like you have foot-and-mouth disease? Before you know it, you've already got your foot in your mouth, but you can't stop for whatever reason, and you're making a situation worse. Husbands, we call that digging a hole. You ever dug a hole? You know what that is. Wives don't dig holes. I don't know why that is. Just husbands. But that happens, doesn't it? The mouth runs before we recognize what's going on. And before we know it, we've made a problem worse. But here's the reality of this. We always have to stand where God stands. And we'll always have to speak where God speaks. Where did these dreams come from? These were not his dreams alone, were they? They were dreams that were coming from God. And he told what he saw inside of his dreams. I think we learn a sub-lesson tonight. Sometimes people don't like what God says. For whatever reason, which I think we understand why the brothers did not love the dream. They already hated him. Now we're going to have to bow down to you. Now you're going to be exalted above us. Get real, they're telling him. Even his father, if you'll look at the ending of this, and we'll see this in just a moment, did not react well to these things. But here's something that's true. He was excited to tell his dreams, and they hated him yet the more. You see, it's interesting to me that hatred builds resentment. They already hated him. Now they hated him yet the more. And when we get to that second dream, they're resenting him. They don't want to hear from him. They don't want to hear what he has to say. Does that ever happen in families? Now I'm going to touch on something that's very complicated. But I want you to answer this in your mind, because I can't answer it for you. I'm going to have to answer it for me, and I ain't telling you what my answer is, and you're not going to tell me what yours is. But have you ever hated someone in your family where you didn't want to hear from them? Have you ever resented someone so much that you didn't even want to hear their words? It happened in Genesis 37, and the brothers, they hated him. They didn't want to hear what he had to say. And if we're honest, sometimes we do that when we're angry. We often refer to husbands and wives with marital spats where you didn't even want to hear what the other person had to say. You know, if we're honest, sometimes these things really hit home, and I think this one does, because hatred builds resentment. And it builds and it builds and it builds until the next thing these brothers are going to say, let's kill him. It can happen in families, can't it? It can happen in congregation. You ever been mad at somebody and never did anything about it until you resented them and you weren't willing to listen to what they say? Does that ever happen to you at work? You ever had someone you resented so much where when they came around, you went the other direction? Maybe we need to say it this way. Have you ever seen somebody do that? We might be willing to answer that question more. Even in our lives, these type of things can happen. And hatred, it builds resentment. And because of these dreams, the resentment was built. Now let's see the words. These are the words that were read for us just a moment ago, and it comes from verse 8. And his brethren said to him, this is after the first dream, shalt thou indeed reign over us? Shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams. Now listen to this. And for his words. I want you to go down to verse 9 and pick up in this particular area and see what was taking place. He told this other dream, verse 9, we read a moment ago, and pick up in verse 10. He told it to his father and his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, what is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come bow ourselves down to thee, to the earth? Verse 11, and his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. His father. I'll go ahead and tell you this, and I think you know this, and men know this more than anything. But young men want the approval of their fathers. And they're not going to come out and say it. Did you ever say it? Because you didn't. Now, you may be the one outlier in our little case study here, but you probably didn't say, are you proud of me? I'm here to tell you that young men, even older men with their fathers who are aging, still want their fathers to be proud of them. And he told his father this dream, and he was rebuked. And his brothers, will we reign over you? You know, what else in this cloudy day needs to happen to this young man for his heart to be broken and he walk away from God? But he doesn't. Here's the truth. You oversee your life and your happiness. If you choose hatred, you will hate. If you choose love, you will love. Remember Genesis 50, 20, and 24? You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good. He says, you go back and you look at the God of God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and He'll be true to you. And throughout all of this process, everything that takes place, I know we can't look at it all. When his brethren meet him in Egypt, when his brethren finally come to him so he can save them, wasn't this man happy? to see his brethren who hated him. You see, the truth is you and I oversee our lives and our happiness. And what we do with our happiness truly is determined by our attitude. Inside of the words, hatred leads to dismissal. His brother, his brothers, and his father for a time. Now, it's interesting to me that inside of this, inside of the ending of verse 11, but his father observed the saying. That's akin to the phrase that's used about the mother of Jesus, who when Jesus was teaching in the temple, you know, when they thought he was with the company and they had left 2 days' journey, I believe it was 2 days, and they recognize he's not there, so they go all the way back to find him, and they ask him, why did you do this? And Jesus famously responds, did you not know I must be about my Father's business? He was there teaching in the synagogues, remember, at a young age. At the end of that occasion, you will read that his mother kept these words. This is the same type thing happening here in Genesis 37. His father, he pondered the saying. He wondered, what did this really mean? And it almost makes me wonder when you look at the phraseology of these words, his father observed the saying, as if he wonders if he was too harsh. We don't know that for sure, but it makes you wonder. But his brothers, they dismissed him, and that was led by hatred. Do we ever dismiss those that are in our families? It's not going to be. That's not going to happen. That'll never happen. Do we ever do that in congregational life? That's never going to happen. Do we dismiss the ideas of others? He was very proud of these dreams, yet he was dismissed. Even in our workplaces and in our lives, sometimes our words can be dismissed, and the words of others, is that really going to come true, ends up being said. Finally, we have the actions. Now, the actions happens in Genesis chapter 37, verse 11. And I want you to see this on the side of the brothers, because they are the ones with the problem of hatred. And his brethren envied him. Boy, that's interesting to me. That's real interesting to me. His brethren envied him. I thought they hated him. Well, they did. I'm telling you, hatred and envy are very close to one another. But there's a difference with envy. There's a very big difference with envy. Envy wants what the other person has. And many times hatred is what breeds envy. Not always the case, but many times it is. They envied him. They were jealous. That's the word we would use. They were jealous of him. This word is used in a very few ways inside of the Old Testament. It means jealous, envious, provoke, and zealous. Now, when it's used as zealous, it's always used in the negative sense. So let's see what their actions were. Their hatred led them to action. What were their actions? Well, pick up in verse 12. And his brethren went to feed their father's flock. Okay, they're off to work. Here they are. They're pretty far away. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's a good thing. But as you follow this out, if you make your way down to verse 18, you read these words. And when they saw him afar off, pause there with me. They saw him when he was far enough that he couldn't hear what they were saying. Keep going. And even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. Genesis 37:18. That escalated quickly, didn't it? That escalated quickly, didn't it? Here he is, coming probably to do his father's bidding, to do what he was told. And they see him a long way off. And here's their words. Let's kill him. Must have been a riveting conversation, wasn't it? Because before he really even got afar off, it says they had already conspired against him. You roll down to verse 19. And they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. This dreamer cometh. It's interesting that he's no longer being referred to as their brother, and they as his brethren. They've hated him so much that he's just this dreamer. You look at verse 20. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit, and we will say some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. We're starting to get to some of the roots, aren't we? They're envying him. They want what he has. They want to see what comes of his dreams. They want to be the center of his dreams, but they're not. I find it very interesting also the language they use in verse 20. Let's slay him and throw him in some pit. And see, it doesn't matter what really happens to him. Let's just kill him and leave him there. Remember where Genesis 50 ends? Genesis 50:24, I die. That doesn't take place, does it? But it was their thoughts. We'll see what becomes of his dreams. You make it down to verse 23. It came to pass when Joseph was come to his brethren. Now, from the perspective of Joseph to his brothers, it's always brethren. But to them, looking back at Joseph, it's always hatred, this dreamer. It came to pass when Joseph came to his brethren, they stripped Joseph of his coat of many colors that was on him. Remember what happened inside of verse 11? They envied him. Well, what did they envy? Well, they envied his dreams. Here comes this dreamer. They envied what his dreams meant, the one who would rise above the rest. They envied the coat of many colors, which I'll suggest to you means they envied the love of their father toward him. I don't think it was about a coat, do you? I think it was about that special love that their father was giving him. And it led them to the conversation of murder. You see, hatred leads to envy. It's interesting that hatred can lead to envy inside of our families, inside of our congregations, as groups of God's people, in our workplaces, and in our regular everyday lives. This can take place. Now I think let your minds go back to Genesis 50, 20 and 24. They strip him of his coat. They sell him. He ends up in Egypt, and he becomes one of the most powerful men in Egypt. And he says to his brethren, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it unto me to good, to save many people. He says in verse 24 of Genesis 50 that they can rely on the God of their fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the same one of which he relied upon. So how did a man who had everything against him stand with God? Because the truth is, he understood that God didn't put him in the pit. He understood that God was not the one who was in control of his misfortune. But he understood that God was always going to be at his side, because he was always going to be at the side of God. You see, he had a lot of issues. He had a problem. His father loved him, but that wasn't something that he did. That was an adult problem brought into the life of a child. And may we never bring adult problems into lives of children. He was hated. But that wasn't his fault, was it? Matter of fact, that wasn't anybody's fault except his brothers and his father. It wasn't his. He had dreams, but he didn't dream those dreams on his own, did he? There were words, and they were words that his brothers said unto him, shall you indeed reign over us? That wasn't his fault. What about his brothers in their action? Was that his fault? When they put him in the pit, when they envied him, when they took his coat, when they sold him, was that his fault? The answer is no. And yet his brethren still said to him, shall you indeed reign over us or have dominion over us? The interesting thing to you and me is, yeah, he's going to reign over you. He is going to have dominion over you, because we've already seen the end before we see the beginning tonight. Now we're back at the end of the story of Genesis 50, 20, and 24, where we have a man who met all the hardships of life, and yet he still trusted God. In his dying days, he tells his brethren, you can trust God. This lesson tonight was not about who was going to reign over who, but it was about who was going to trust in God. Tonight, how do you trust in God? Have you trusted Him enough to become His child? Maybe you need to become a child of God tonight. That opportunity is here for you. Have you trusted Him enough to be faithful? You know, the word faithful sometimes is very subjective because we use it in a variety of ways. But let me tell you this. This is what the word faithful really means. Do you trust God enough to be in heaven? That's what faithful means. The faithful will be in heaven. And that's what you want to be, and that's what I want to be. Do you trust God enough to be faithful? To go to heaven? To obey Him? I'm not saying to be perfect because we're not perfect people. But we have an opportunity as children of God to be forgiven for our entire lives if we're willing to do so. Maybe that's you tonight. Caleb has picked out a song for us. And I don't think any of you have probably hated your own family. I hope not. Hopefully, if you have, that's behind you. But I want to ask you a serious question. And it has to do with hate. And your reaction to this question is going to be a little bit sideways. So buckle up for this question. Do you hate yourself? Boy, that's an odd question, isn't it? It's an odd one. I'm here to tell you tonight that the only person in this room, I'm saying this of me and not of you, but you'll be able to do this for yourself. The only person in this room who can send Jonathan Burns to hell is me. And I'm going to have to love this world more than I love the Lord to do it. That means I'm going to have to hate myself more than I hate the devil. And that's a hard position in life to be in. You need to become a child of God tonight? You can. You need to make your life right with the Lord? You can. Let's sing this song and let's respond accordingly.